If you haven't already, please take a second to subscribe to the channel and also don't forget to click on the notification bell so you'll be up to date on all videos released from the Everything Network.
Robert Ronald Simon was born on September 4, 1951, in Darby, Delaware County, Pennsylvania. His criminal activity reportedly became known as early as his preteen years. Additionally, Simon was placed into juvenile detention on at least 2 separate occasions. Throughout his youth, he was a member of an Upper Darby street gang known as the Warlords. The Warlords would eventually merge with another group from Darby to create the Warlocks Motorcycle Club, also referred to as the Philly Warlocks. Founded in 1967, the Warlocks are self-described as a one-percenter outlaw motorcycle club and are designated as a violent criminal organization by law enforcement. Although the club was predominantly based within their founding location of Philadelphia, as well as other parts of Pennsylvania, they also maintained a chapter within New Jersey. Being a member of the gang was such a substantial part of Simon's life, to the point where he would even tout his religion as Warlock. He was said to have held the club title of Enforcer and was utilized by his fellow Warlock co-founders to intimidate the club's rivals. The Warlocks menaced the state of Pennsylvania during the 1970s, and Simon was often described as an ill-tempered and especially dangerous member by those who knew and encountered him. At various points in his career as a hardened outlaw biker, Simon burned down a store on the Ocean City, New Jersey boardwalk and committed armed robbery. A frequent user of drugs and alcohol, he went by the club moniker Mudman, as well as informal nickname of Bobby Simon. At one point, Simon had a spiderweb tattooed onto his elbow, which was rumored to signify he had murdered someone. In 1982, he was convicted for the 1974 second-degree murder of his 19-year-old girlfriend, Beth Smith Duesenberg, who had refused to engage in group sex with him and other members of the Warlocks. According to his fellow Warlock bikers, Simon talked about having sexual intercourse with Duesenberg's mummified corpse after he buried it in a water-filled strip mine near Hazleton, and even hoped to decorate his jail cell with physical photographs of such evidence. John Lavelle, the judge who handled Simon's trial, stated that dozens of Warlocks bikers would circle the courthouse on their motorcycles each day during 1995 in an attempt to intimidate the jurors, quite possibly the reason behind his conviction for second-degree murder instead of first-degree murder. Robert subsequently received a 10 to 20-year sentence for the homicide and was initially housed at State Correctional Institution, Graterford, but later transferred. Throughout his prison tenure, he received a total of 49 misconducts, which included drug trafficking in addition to drug use. Simon was also suspected of murdering an inmate at State Correctional Institution, Pittsburgh, during his incarceration period. However, he was acquitted on the grounds of self-defense. On January 21, 1993, the Pennsylvania Board of Probation and Parole, PBPP, denied a parole application they received from Simon, citing his high risk of continued involvement with the Philly Warlocks, along with his need for substance abuse treatment. Despite this, he was classified as merely a low risk on parole assessment documents. After a total 3 parole rejections, Simon was recommended for parole in November 1994 by a PBPP hearing examiner under the condition that he abstain from alcohol and avoid contact with the Warlocks Motorcycle Club. Suspiciously, it is known that one of the club's members began to make arrangements for Simon's living arrangements even before Simon's parole was approved. Robert was paroled in February 1995, having served a total of 12.5 years of prison time. With approval from the New Jersey Parole Board, he settled at Black Horse RV Trailer Park in Williamstown, New Jersey, when released. The property was owned by Marianne Mihalik, who lived with her daughter right across from Simon's trailer home at 3944 South Black Horse Pike. As claimed by Mihalik, they both had been unaware of Robert's homicidal history, as he misled them to believing he was just a reformed drug dealer. Unbeknownst to the parole board's officials, the Warlocks Motorcycle Club had quite the presence within the area, which was even regarded to be a stronghold for the biker gang. Furthermore, Simon's trailer home residence was only a few feet from a bar known to be frequented by Warlocks bikers. Simon continued to use drugs and associate with the Warlocks MC in violation of his parole conditions. On May 6, 1995, Robert Simon, along with the vice president of the Warlocks South Jersey chapter, Charles "Shovel" Staples, were both sitting in a car in Franklin Township, Gloucester County, New Jersey, when they were pulled over by 15-year Franklin Township police veteran Hipólito Lee Gonzalez as part of a routine traffic stop. Earlier that day, a nearby environmental heating building had been burglarized, and the vehicle occupied by both men was situated within the vicinity. Sergeant Gonzalez exited his patrol cruiser and proceeded to question the vehicle's occupants. While examining Simon's social security card and Staples' driver's license, he requested for backup on his police radio. After doing so, one of the two Warlock bikers shot Gonzalez a total of 2 times. The first bullet passed through the side of his neck, knocking the officer to the ground. The second and final gunshot entered Gonzalez's skull behind his right ear, lodging itself within his brain. In a haste, Staples immediately drove himself and Simon away from the area, but was soon pursued by nearby police officers who had heard the 2 gunshots on Sergeant Gonzalez's radio request for backup. At an eventual point during the chase, Staples managed to lose control over the car and crashed it into a guardrail. Simon promptly departed from the vehicle's passenger side and attempted to flee the area on foot, whilst aiming his gun at one of the responding police officers who was ordering him to halt. After refusing to abide the warning, the officer shot Simon in the leg, which caused him to flip over the guardrail and surrender to the authorities thereafter. Simon and Staples were then taken into police custody. Evidence collected from the car confirmed that the 2 gang members were, in fact, the ones who had robbed Environmental Heating Building. Franklin Township Police Sergeant Hipólito Gonzalez died the following day via the gunshot wounds sustained from the incident. A firearms expert would later testify that the weapon found near Simon when during his apprehension was the same one used to kill Gonzalez. Despite pressure from his fellow Warlocks, Simon eventually confessed to the crime and, as a result, was sentenced to death by the state of New Jersey in April 1997. According to some reports, Robert Simon had a reputation for taunting fellow inmates at New Jersey State Prison and apparently selected a convict named Ambrose Harris, who had been on death row for kidnapping and killing 22-year-old artist Kristen Huggins in 1992. Harris and Simon had been assigned to side-by-side cells in the facility's capital sentence unit. On September 7, 1999, a reported fistfight broke out between Harris and Simon while the pair were in one of the prison recreational areas. Harris repeatedly kicked and stomped Simon before jumping from a table's stainless steel stool and landing on his head, fatally crushing Simon's skull. Harris was charged with murder, but acquitted on the grounds of self-defense. He later died in 2020. Louis Roy was born and grew up in Trois-Rivières. He was a member of the Saint-Éloi-based Missiles outlaw biker gang, which later became the Satan's Guard Club of Saguenay. Roy founded and led Satan's Guard with Richard "Crow" Aime as his second-in-command, and the club became the dominant gang in the Saguenay, Lac-Saint-Jean region by eliminating any rivals. In October 1984, Satan's Guard blew up the van of Aime Gagnon, president of the El Conquatros gang in Chicoutimi. 2 independent drug dealers were also targeted in a car bombing in front of the Maria Chapdelaine College in Jonquière, QC, in October 1990. Satan's Guard patched over to join the Hells Angels on the 14th of June 1991. He became the president of the Angels' Trois-Rivières chapter, which forged a close alliance with the Rizzuto family of Montreal. Roy also forged a close friendship with Maurice Boucher. Journalist André Sedelot called Louis Roy the second most powerful Hells Angel in Quebec after Boucher, saying, "He was one of the most influential members of the Hells Angels." His status as the richest Hells Angel was due to the fact that he had almost a monopoly on the drug trade in Trois-Rivières. He was also very active in selling cocaine throughout Quebec, making him into one of the most important drug dealers in La Belle Province. In November 1994, Roy hired Serge Quesnel via Quesnel's lawyer to work as a hitman for the Hells Angels. After his release from prison, Quesnel's lawyer introduced him to Roy. Roy told Quesnel that in exchange for working as a hitman, he would be paid $500 per week, with a commission of at least $10,000 per murder. Roy told Quesnel that his commissions would depend on the degree of difficulty of the murders, with commissions of $50,000 to be paid for those who were well guarded. Quesnel wrote in his 2003 memoirs Testament d'un tueur de Hells that Milou was the richest angel in Quebec, and I was his protégé. We travelled together, and I could see that he was among the most powerful members of the profession. He carried a booklet with the names, addresses, license plate numbers, and descriptions of 50 or so undesirable individuals. When I saw it, I realized that the Trois-Rivières Hells Angels were very powerful. Roy gave Quesnel $2,000 in cash as an advance payment and promised him $8,000 more if he killed Jacques Ferland. Ferland was a chemist in Quebec City who manufactured PCP for the rock machine. Quesnel killed Ferland in his Quebec City house on the 30th of January 1995. On the 27th of February 1995, Quesnel killed Claude the Peak Rivard, a Montreal drug dealer who worked for the Pelletier clan, who were allied with the rock machine. On the 23rd of March 1995, Quesnel killed Richard Chico Delcourt, a Montreal drug dealer who refused to work with either the rock machine or the Hells Angels. Quesnel later testified that he had committed all these murders on Roy's orders. Roy offered Quesnel $50,000 in cash if he could kill Gilles Lambert, an important leader of the rock machine. Quesnel was arrested in April 1995 before he could make the attempt on Lambert's life. After Quesnel became a delateur, informer, following his arrest in April 1995, Roy was arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, along with Sylvain Baptiste IV, the vice president of the Trois-Rivières chapter. After his arrest, Roy was replaced as Trois-Rivières chapter president by Richard "Crow" Aime. On the 25th of June 1995, Roy became a founding member of the Angels Elite Nomad chapter. Besides for Roy, the other members of the Nomad chapter were Walter Stadnick, Maurice Boucher, Donald Pup Stockford, David Wolfe Carroll, Gilles Trooper Mathieu, Richard Bert Mayrand, Pierre Lauren, Richard Rick Vallée, André Chouinard, Michel Rose, Denis Pas-Fiable Houle, Normand Robitaille, Norman Biff Hamel, and René Balloon Charlebois. Roy was considered to be one of the more able Hells Angels and was included in the Nomad chapter for that reason. On April 4, 1997, while Roy and Thefalt were being driven in an armoured car to the courthouse to hear the verdict in the murder case against them, the duo were most surprised to share the same car with Robert Hardy of the Rock Machine. Taking advantage of the opportunity, Roy and Thefalt beat up Hardy during their ride to the courthouse. When the car arrived, the bloodied and battered body of Hardy fell out, who had to be rushed to the hospital to save his life. Quesnel turned out to be a very poor witness for the Crown, and the trial ended with both Roy and Thefalt acquitted on all counts. Following his acquittal, Roy returned to Trois-Rivières. The Trois-Rivières chapter maintained several puppet clubs, such as the Jokers of Saint Jean, the Blatnois of Mauricie, and the Roadie crew of Lanaudière. Following Roy's release, 6 members of the puppet gangs suddenly disappeared, never to be heard or seen from again. At the same time, Roy sent out Hell's Angels to search the houses of the vanished members, removing various items over the protests of the girlfriends and wives of the missing men. The missing men are Ormond Dorrant, Guy Magenu, Benoit Lachance, Clermont Carrier, Edward Villiers, and Sylvain Bernard. On August 23, 1997, Roy survived an attempted murder by the contract killer Gérald Galland outside his parents' motel, the Motel Royal in Jonquière, where he resided. Gallant waited in a swamp near the motel's parking lot and emerged with 2 loaded revolvers when he saw Roy returning. Roy was alerted by the sound of Gallant's wet shoes as he approached, and he was able to evade most of the hitman's gunfire, but suffered a wound to the chest. Gallant, who fled the scene when he ran out of ammunition, was paid $20,000 by Rock Machine member Marcel Lemaire Demers for the failed assassination. Prior to the shooting, Gallant's mistress and accomplice, Jacqueline Benoit, had rented a room at the motel to carry out surveillance on Roy. Lewis refused to cooperate with the police, whom he called pigs, and refused to file a complaint about the shooting. The informer Danny Kane mentioned in his notes to his police handlers that Hell's Angel David Carroll had told him that Boucher had reached an agreement with Vito Rizzuto that price of cocaine in Canada was to be $50,000 per kilogram. Kane also reported that the penalty for selling cocaine below that price was to be death. Kane reported that a gang within the gang called La Table, consisting of Boucher, Denis Houle, Michel Rose, Normand Robitaille, and André Chouinard, set the prices for drugs in Quebec in consultation with the mafia. Carroll mentioned to Kane that Boucher wanted Roy to join La Table, which he refused to, leading to Carroll to express the hope there would be no issues caused by this refusal. Finally, Kane mentioned that both Boucher and Rizzuto were very annoyed that Roy persisted with selling cocaine below $50,000 per kilogram and wanted him to join La Table. On the 23rd of June 2000, Roy disappeared after departing to attend a party at the house of Boucher's father to celebrate the 5th anniversary of the founding of the Nomads. Roy had frequently ignored Boucher's orders by selling cocaine for less than $50,000 per kilogram, which was reported to have angered Boucher, but Roy believed that his status as a founding member of the Nomad chapter gave him immunity from being punished. In July 2001, Elias Lekas of the West End Gang testified that Roy went from the Boucher household to a meat processing plant owned by Gerald Mattix. Roy was then bound, gagged, and while still alive, ran through a meat grinding machine. The mafiosi Andrew Scopper, who was a member of the Rizzuto family, in his posthumously published 2022 book, La Source, confirmed that Roy's cause of death was being run through a meat grinder. Scopper was murdered on the 21st of October 2019 in Montreal, being found shot dead in front of a store at 4744 Saint-Jean Boulevard. However, Scopa was interviewed several times between October 2014 and October 2019 by journalists Félix Seguem and Eric Thibault, where he spoke frankly about his underworld activities on the condition that the interviews be only published after his death. In an interview with Seguem and Thibault, Scopa stated that Rizzuto had made a secret deal with Boucher that in exchange for throwing the full support of the Rizzuto family against the Rock Machine and killing the pro-Rock Machine Rizzuto family capo Paolo Gervasi, that Boucher would, in exchange, would have Roy killed. Scopa maintained that Boucher had tolerated Roy selling cocaine below $50,000 per kilogram as a way to pressure Rizzuto to act against Gervasi, who had taken a very pro-Rock Machine line. Gervasi ran a strip club, the Castel Tina, along with his son Salvatore, where members of the Rock Machine always had reserved tables and were allowed to wear their gang colours. The Rock Machine had been supported financially by the Dark Circle, a group of outwardly respectable Montreal businessmen who covertly engaged in organised crime, hence the name. The Dark Circle supplied the money that allowed the Rock Machine to buy cocaine and to hire hitmen. In 1998, Salvatore Brunetti, a prominent Montreal restaurateur and a member of the Dark Circle, defected to the Hells Angels. Brunetti provided the Angels with the names and addresses of the other members of the Dark Circle, whom the Angels then proceeded to hunt down. The end of the Dark Circle had largely driven the Rock Machine out of the drug business by depriving them of capital. By 2000, the Gervasis were the only people still willing to sell the Rock Machine drugs. Scopa stated that Boucher's attitude was both sides had to take care of their own garbage, and that he would only have Roy killed if Rizzuto had Gervasi killed, which led to an agreement being struck along that line. Salvatore Gervasi was killed on April 22, 2000, being found shot dead inside of his parked automobile. According to Scopa, Roy went to Boucher's party and then went to the meat factory to meet Gerald Mattix. Scopa stated that Roy was self-confident, as he was with his friends, and had no fears about the meeting at the meat factory. After his arrival at the factory, he was seized by his so-called friends, who proceeded to run him through the meat grinder while still alive. In return, Rizzuto had an attempt made against the life of Paolo Gervasi in August of 2000, causing him to drift to the sidelines of the Rizzuto family. On January 19, 2004, Gervasi was killed outside of a bakery in the St. Leonard district of Montreal. After his disappearance, Roy's assets were all divided up by his fellow nomads, as if he had never existed. Other members of the Hells Angels who had vanished and later turned out to still be alive, such as the hitman Paul Fontaine and Richard Valet, were still listed on the membership lists of the Angels, but Roy's name was abruptly removed from the membership lists in June 2000. Paul Cherry, the crime correspondent of the Montreal Gazette, wrote that Roy's sudden and unexplained removal from the Hells Angels membership lists indicated that he was dead. The police believe it was no accident that at the same time that Roy vanished in late June 2000, that Luc Bordelot of the Hells Angels puppet gang, the Rockers Motor Club, was suddenly promoted up to be a prospect with the Hells Angels proper. Roy's girlfriend, Rosalba Guerrera, never reported him missing. When Sûreté du Québec detectives questioned her on the 3rd of August 2000, she stated, "It's been 15 years that I've been with a member of the Hells. I live in that world, and I know how it works. Now, I'm going to try and rebuild my life." On December 12, 2000, the account that Roy had with the Nomad Bank in Montreal was terminated, with the money being divided amongst the other nomads, which was a strong sign that Roy was not longer with the Hells Angels. Regardless of his precise fate, Roy was never seen or heard from again after going to Boucher's party. Roy's blue Mercedes-Benz was found parked on the street near the house of Boucher's father several days after his disappearance, covered in unpaid parking tickets. It is generally accepted that Roy is dead. Tim McKinley, an FBI agent who'd been the anti-Hells Angels specialist in the Bureau, told the Canadian journalists Julian Scher and William Marsden in a 2006 interview. What he wanted to do was just give us a bunch of information, and we do wiretaps, and everybody would go to jail. He was kind of shocked to find out just how complicated it was. 2. McKinley used Tate as a walking electronics platform to record everything that the Hells Angels said and did. McKinley stated what he was tasked to do was to identify the upper-level leadership of the Hells Angels, identify the criminal structure of the organization, track the money, track the dope. McKinley wanted Tate to provide the evidence to convict Sonny Barger, whom he described as a wily and formidable opponent. McKinley said of Barger, "Balls, the guy certainly has balls." McKinley formed a partnership with Ted Bolters of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives to handle the case. Both Bolters and McKinley stated that past efforts against Barger had failed because of bureaucratic infighting between different branches of the US government. Bolters said, "In the early days, each agency wanted to control its own investigation. The DEA doing drugs, the FBI doing their things, the AFT guns and bombs. The whole idea of collaborating and sharing wasn't there. We didn't have the resources, the knowledge, the manpower, or we weren't smart enough to do it." The partnership between Bolters and McKinley surprised many in the US government, as Bolters stated. The fact that the ATF and the FBI worked together so closely left a lot of people speechless. Past investigations into the Hells Angels had also failed because of corruption within the US government. As McKinley stated, officials of the government routinely sold information to the Angel. McKinley stated that the way the Hells Angels knew far too much about FBI investigations and were always able to take measures to avoid being arrested could only be explained by corruption. McKinley used as example how in the early 1980s the Hells Angels always moved their methamphetamine labs once the FBI put them under surveillance, which he argued could only be explained by corruption within the FBI. To prevent more corruption, the team handling Tate was kept very small, with 8 FBI and 2 ATF agents handling him. Tate only used pagers and payphones to communicate with his handlers. The operation was codenamed Cacus, after the centaur in the Inferno who rules the Circle of Hell, reserved for the souls of thieves. McKinley had wanted to name the operation Charon, after the boatman of Greek mythology who carried the souls of the dead across the river Styx, to symbolize his intention to send away the Hells Angels forever, but found that the name Charon had been used for a prior operation. McKinley praised Tate as an informer, as he stated, "He's got an ego the size of Montana, but he is perfectly willing to follow instructions and report accurately." Tate's swagger, aggression, and apparent success as a drug dealer allowed him to become the Hells Angels' point man for the entire West Coast. He met Barger numerous times. Barger later wrote, "Judging by the way he threw money around, I figured he dealt drugs or something." Tate usually wore 2 wires for his meetings in case the batteries failed on one of his wires, and also had a bug in his pager. Tate visited nearly every Hells Angels chapter in the world. Tate was paid $4,000 per month by the FBI. On the 12th of August 1986, a Hells Angel, John Webb, was murdered by several members of the Outlaws Motorcycle Club in Louisville, Kentucky. Barger appointed Tate to lead the campaign against the Outlaws in Kentucky, which nearly derailed Operation Cacus. Under American law, informers may not commit murders and their handlers may not permit a murder to occur, and Tate's assignment in Kentucky presented major problems for his handlers. On the 17th of August 1986, Tate attended a meeting of the Oakland chapter where Barger discussed the identification numbers and home addresses of a number of outlaw leaders. Barger also had much information from the El Paso Information Center that was meant to serve as an information bank for American law enforcement. The way that Barger had a secret book about the outlaws from the information center meant only for police officers alarmed Tate's handlers, as it showed the extent of police corruption was far deeper than previously thought. As Barger handed around the files, one Hells Angel chapter president was recorded as saying to Tate, the book would be useful in setting out targets. On the 29th of September 1986, Tate visited Barger at his house in Oakland. Barger showed Tate the names and photographs of various outlaw leaders from the epic book. According to a FBI affidavit, Barger told Tate how to retaliate against members of the Outlaws Motorcycle Club by murdering them one at a time. On the 30th of November 1986, Tate attended a meeting of the Oakland Clubhouse where the Hells Angels spoke about their defense fund that existed to hire lawyers for those angels facing criminal charges. Barger was recorded as saying that he tried to know as little as possible about the uses of the defense fund and said, "There was a judge back east that got convicted of accepting some of that." He made a gesture that resembled handing money under the table as he made that remark. Barger was apparently referring to a case in Cleveland where a judge had been bribed to throw a case that ended with the acquittal of a Hells Angel on trial for murder. On the 17th of January 1987, at a visit to Barger House, Tate asked for advice about killing outlaws. Barger told him, "It doesn't matter which one. You're not going to get the guys that did it. You can snipe one of them. Don't get caught." In September 1987, 3 Hells Angels were beaten up by the outlaws in Joliet, Illinois, who stole their bikers' vests with their Hells Angels patches, a humiliation that enraged Barger. On the 18th of October 1987, Tate was to again visit Barger's house and was notably nervous before the meeting. Tate drank heavily to steel his nerves by having several shots of whiskey. At the meeting, Tate spoke explicitly to Barger about plans to kill several outlaw leaders in the Midwest and received his approval. Tate showed Barger his plans to bomb the Outlaws Clubhouse in Chicago, which he predicated would kill 5 or 6 people. Barger replied, "Good, especially after Joliet." Tate stated, "There might be innocent people there." Barger answered him, "That's what they get for hanging around with guys like that." Along with the Grim Reapers MC, the Warlords, and Rebels MC, the King's Crew became one of the 4 dominant outlaw motorcycle clubs operating in Alberta prior to 1997. By the late 1990s, the King's Crew became part of the Hells Angels in a patchover ceremony held in Calgary, Alberta. Throughout the 1970s, the Rebels had multiple violent exchanges with their main rivals in the province, the Grim Reapers MC. Most of the clashes occurred off of the authorities' radar and received little media attention. The 1970s would prove to be an extremely dominant period for the Rebels. The club held an iron-fisted territorial policy, which saw them battle for dominance in the province against several other groups, and since the club's creation in 1968, it has either defeated or absorbed 13 separate clubs in Alberta. Their cuts were taken and displayed upside down on the walls of the Rebels' mother chapter. In 1975, the Rebels gained a certain level of notoriety, respect in some circles, due to their publicized conflicts with Francophone unit of Canadian Airborne Regiment known as 1 Commando. In one of these infamous clashes, about 40 members of the Airborne showed up with nunchaku, steel bars, baseball bats, and blackjacks, and ambushed 23 rebels at the club bar in Edmonton. After a skirmish, the bruised and battered paratroopers retreated, and the rebels went back to their business. This event came to be known as Battle of the Kingsway in rebel folklore. In the early 80s, as the Reapers grew more powerful and the rebels less so, the rebels were warned by the Reapers not to fly the Alberta Lower Rocker on threat of club warfare. So members of the rebels' Calgary chapter used southern Alberta for the Lower Rocker, and Edmonton members flew northern Alberta. King's crew, meanwhile, were tolerated in their use of Calgary as the Lower Rocker, while the Saskatchewan rebels, at that point being the dominant club in that province, flew Saskatchewan as their Lower Rocker. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, the golden era in Western Canada for independent one-percenter clubs, the Rebels were the dominant club in the Edmonton area, while the Reapers were the largest club in Red Deer and Calgary. In 1977, the King's Crew was established and quickly became a major player in Alberta, especially Calgary. During this time, they would align themselves with the Rebels MC, who had also become an enemy of the Reapers. In the 1980s, they would become much more involved in the Alberta biker conflict. The conflict would ultimately come to an end when all major parties patched over to the Hells Angels in the late 1990s. On February 1983, for aligning with their main rivals in the province, the Rebels MC, members of the Grim Reapers would steal the cuts off of 5 members of the King's Crew at gunpoint. They were set on fire and delivered to the offices of the Calgary newspaper. In March 1983, multiple assault rifle bullets are shot at the Grim Reapers' Calgary chapter clubhouse. It is believed that the attack was carried out by the King's Crew MC. On April 13, 1983, the King's Crew clubhouse is targeted by a bombing. The building is destroyed. On April 27, 1983, King's Crew MC President Melvin Jordan's house is bombed. 15 rounds from an assault rifle struck the property. He survived the attempt. On May 16, 1983, full patch member of the Grim Reapers, Larry Graham's car is bombed. King's Crew members are suspected of the bombing. On June 8, 1983, turning allegiances after the assassination attempt out of fear for his life, now King's Crew affiliate Larry Graham and his wife are the victims of an attempted kidnapping. Larry Graham is struck in the head with a firearm. On June 10, 1983, King's Crew Ronald Wrongway Moore is assassinated. His Jeep was rigged with an explosive and exploded when he tried to start the vehicle. On July 30, 1983, the Southside Harley and Speed, a motorcycle shop owned by Grim Reapers members in Edmonton, Alberta, is bombed and destroyed. King's Crew Motorcycle Club members are suspected. On December 18, 1983, James St. Pierre, member of the King's Crew, arrives at the hospital with multiple stab wounds. It is believed to be members of the Grim Reapers that were responsible. On January 22, 1984, King's Crew member Stephen Albert Joel is killed outside of his home. Grim Reapers are accused of the shooting. In April 1984, member of the King's Crew, Wayne Jordan was exiting a store when 2 Grim Reapers approached him and pointed firearm at him. He ran into the store and called the authorities, identifying the opposing club members who were placed in police custody. The King's Crew Motorcycle Club kicked him out of the club for informing police. On August 13, 1984, Grim Reapers member David Wershek is hospitalized by King's Crew members. On July 26, 1987, King's Crew member Richard Moyes is knocked unconscious by Michael Doll, Kerry Eastman, and Derek Smith. Members of the Grim Reapers Motorcycle Club, they also took his cut. On October 1, 1987, full patch member of King's crew, Louis Aaron Blatt is reported missing by his wife, Valerie Blatt. It is assumed that the Grim Reapers had taken him and murdered him, disposed of the body. It was believed by local authorities that the body was disposed of without a trace to stop the King's Crew Club from claiming the $50,000 life insurance policy payout.
If you haven't already, please take a second to subscribe to the channel, and also don't forget to click on the notification bell, so you'll be up to date on all videos released from the Everything Network.
Don Hancock, known as the Silver Fox, or as the Don, was one of the most respected and honoured policemen in Australia. In 1982, he had investigated the Perth Mint swindle case that saw the three Mickelberg brothers convicted for stealing 65 kilograms of gold, a theft that had acquired a golden reputation in Australia and made Hancock into a local celebrity. Hancock had served as the director of the Criminal Investigation Branch of the Western Australia Police Force. Hancock, with his white hair, expensive clothing, and an easygoing manner, reminded many of a courtly gentleman, an impression further reinforced by his tendency to recite poetry in his booming voice. He could recite from memory the poems in the 1870 book Bush Ballads and Galloping Rhymes by Adam Lindsay Gordon, and his recitations commanded attention. However, the Don was known to his colleagues, such as Detective Jack Peter Lee, to have a dark side, as he was extremely ruthless and competitive, as he would not accept any sort of personal defeat. The normally affable Hancock was known to explode in fury if he lost a game of billiards, as he insisted that he had to win at everything, and to lose at anything would reduce him to a state of white-hot rage. For this reason, other police officers would not play billiards with him or intentionally lose the game rather than face his anger. Hancock's triumph in the Perth Mint swindle was marred by allegations that he had tortured one of the Mickelberg brothers, Peter, into confessing to the theft. The Mickelberg brothers were acquitted in 2004. The Canadian journalists Julian Scher and William Marsden described Hancock as being a frontier justice policeman whose methods were better suited to a gold rush community in the outback in the 19th century than to modern Australia. The Australian journalist Tony Barras wrote in 2018, "A no-nonsense, old-school detective, Hancock's running battles with the Mickelberg brothers of Perth Mint swindle fame, along with a range of high-profile criminal cases, including the Shirley Finn murder, had made him a household name in WA, Western Australia. Big, intimidating, with a booming voice, you did not mess with the Silver Fox." After his retirement in 1994, the Don spent much time in the outback community of Ora Banda, a village of about 50 people that was dominated by his family. The Hancock family had arrived in Australia from England during an 1893 gold rush. Both Hancock's father and grandfather had prospected for gold in the Ora Banda area, and he felt a deep connection to a community that he considered home. Ora Banda was a community that was economically dominated by Hancock, who owned via his company Wentworth Holdings WA Thai Limited, the local pub, the trailer park, the general store, the Ora Banda Historic Inn, the only restaurant in Ora Banda, along with its beer garden, the other only motel in Ora Banda, and the 19th century gold crusher that was still working in 2000. Outside of the pub was a racetrack managed by Hancock, who held the annual Kalgoorlie racing round there. He did not own the racetrack, but behaved as if he did. Finally, he owned a gold concession, Grant's Patch, that had a shack that contained a .303 rifle and 51 rounds of ammunition. He had hopes of turning Ora Banda, an early 20th century gold rush boomtown, into a tourist attraction that would remind Australians of their heritage. Hancock was an avid hunter of kangaroos, and was by all accounts an excellent shot. On Sunday, October 1st, 2000, Hancock, along with his wife Elizabeth, were expecting an influx of tourists at the Ora Banda Historical Inn. Elizabeth Hancock told Sharon Marsden in 2006, "It was a really lovely sunny day, and we had lots of people out. The bar and beer garden were full, and everyone was really happy." Among those present in Ora Banda that day were 2 officers of the Western Australia Police who had driven out from Kalgoorlie to see Hancock, Senior Sergeant Kim Gage and Detective Senior Constable Sean Gartland. Hancock had spent the morning prospecting for gold in the outback and at noon was drinking with his wife Elizabeth, along with Gage and Gartland and their wives. At that moment, a group of gypsy jokers roared into Ora Banda on their motorcycles and wearing their gang colours. Amongst the gypsy jokers were Graham Slim Slater, William Joseph Billy Grierson and Sydney John Reed. The bikies, the Australian term for outlaw bikers, were all from the Kalgoorlie chapter of the Gypsy Jokers. The Gypsy Jokers were an American club whose first Australian chapter had been established in 1969 in Melbourne. The Gypsy Jokers were viewed by the police as one of the most violent biker gangs in Australia. The Gypsy Jokers set up a campfire under a giant banner that read Gypsy Joker Motorcycle Club. Much to Hancock's displeasure, the Gypsy Jokers raced around the racetrack in their motorcycles and did much damage to the grounds. Hancock had long hated outlaw bikers, whom he referred to as criminal scumbags, and was clearly deeply unhappy about the presence of the Gypsy Jokers in Ora Banda. Rebecca Price, the chef of the Ora Banda Inn's restaurant, recalled that Hancock was drunk that day and in a belligerent mood as he cursed at his wife for taking too long in the washroom. Price told Sharon Marsden, "When Don has been drinking, he's generally a lot worse. He's got that typical policeman's attitude that he's higher up than anyone else and can do whatever he wants. When he really does drink, he doesn't drink in moderation. He drinks like a fish." At about 4 p.m., the Gypsy Jokers entered the restaurant and ordered drinks. Price stated that Elizabeth Hancock was worried as she kept saying, "I wish these damn bikies would go," and "I'm just worried about Don." By this time, Gage and Gartland had left for Kalgoorlie. There was much tension in the pub as Hancock made clear his unhappiness that the Gypsy Jokers were drinking in his bar. Trouble began at about 6 p.m. when one of the Gypsy Jokers, James Spud Manson, tried to provoke a fight with another bar patron, Robbie Mitchell, which increased the tension in the pub. Manson told Mitchell, "You're a fucking wanker." Hancock stiffly ordered Manson to stop harassing Mitchell and to return to his table. His daughter Alison worked as a waitress in the restaurant, and at that point she was subjected to crude sexual advances from the Gypsy Jokers. Hancock, with a cold fury in his voice, told the Gypsy Jokers, "This is my daughter behind the bar. I'd appreciate it if you would refrain from talking like that. If there's any sign of trouble, I'm going to close the pub." "Oh," knee of the Gypsy Jokers, William Billy Grierson, told Hancock no worries. About 5 minutes later, Grierson went up to Hancock to tell him, "Don't you threaten us. I'll go and drink our own beer." Hancock replied, "What are you on about?" Grierson replied, "If that's your fucking attitude, we'll just go down and drink piss beer out of our esky hula." Hancock shouted, "That's it, I don't need this. I'm closing the pub." Moment later, a furious Hancock drove off in his Ford 100 Ute, the Australian English term for a pickup truck, in the direction of Grant's Patch. Curtin Forster, a mine technician, asked Alison Hancock what was happening and received the reply, "Dad's closing the bar and he's going to get his gun." The Gypsy Jokers returned to their campfire when they started to drink beer out of their cooler. At about 7:15 p.m., Hancock returned from Grant's Patch. One of the pub's cooks, Patricia McQueen, was told by Elizabeth Hancock, "I'd better go and find Don before he does something stupid." At about 7:45 p.m., a gunman opened fire with a rifle at the Gypsy Jokers. The Gypsy Jokers took cover, but then decided that it was just someone hunting kangaroos in the evening. Slater stated in a 2018 interview, "Billy said, 'He's probably just trying to scare us.' And I said, 'Well, he's doing a bloody good job.' Anyway, about 15 minutes goes past, and Billy then says, 'Fuck this.' We went back to where we were, and the next shot went straight through him." At about 7:55 p.m., the gunman opened fire again and killed Grierson. The bullet entered under his left shoulder blade, severed his spinal cord, and exited under his right chest cavity, killing him. Slater stated in the same 2018 interview, "I tell you one thing, he was a bloody good shot. It must have been 600 meters away in the dark." It remains unclear even today if the shooter was trying to scare away the Gypsy Jokers or was trying to kill Grierson. The Gypsy Jokers fled in terror with Grierson's corpse to the Coors nickel mine that was located 9 miles away. Upon being informed by the mine's first aid post attendants that Grierson was dead, the Gypsy Jokers removed his biker's vest, which had the Gypsy Joker patch on the back, along with badges on the front, decorated with the Iron Cross and a Nazi swastika. Likewise, they removed his belt, whose buckle was shaped in the patch of the Gypsy Jokers. Grierson's corpse was abandoned along a dirt road. A team of policemen arrived to investigate the murder. Price and McQueen both mentioned to the officers that Allison and Elizabeth Hancock had both stated that Donald Hancock had gone to get his rifle shortly before Grierson was killed. Of the about 40 people present when Grierson was killed, Donald Hancock was the only person who did not have an alibi for where he was when the murder occurred. Elizabeth Hancock told Price, "I left the pub at 7:20 p.m. I went home, and Don was having a shower. He was home all the time. I sniffed Don's guns, and they didn't smell as if they'd been fired." Price found her remark to be an odd one. One of the officers, Senior Constable Dave Roper, interviewed Hancock, who seemed calm. When Roper told him that someone had apparently been killed, Hancock grew angry and asked him, "What do you mean apparently?" Roper replied, "Well, I wasn't here at the time, so I can only say apparently." Hancock asked him, "What do you mean?" Roper stated, "Mr. Hancock, I'm aware of who you are and what you used to be, so you know what I mean when I say apparently." Hen Hancock asked if he was a suspect. Roper told him that everyone was a suspect at the moment. Hancock held up his hands in a mock surrender and told Roper, "I'm saying nothing. You'll have to speak with my solicitor." Roper told Hancock to remain at the inn, but he ignored that request by returning to his house. Roper sent 2 constables, Justin Dwyer and Max Jancy, to go find Hancock. Upon arriving at his house, they met Hancock, whom they noticed had just taken a shower and was wearing new clothes. The 2 officers noticed that Hancock was eating an orange and his hands were soaked in orange juice. It is widely, but wrongly believed that the citric acid in oranges destroys gunpowder residue. Dwyer and Jancer informed Hancock that he was supposed to remain at the inn and received the reply that he was not answering any questions. Only when Dwyer and Jancer threatened to arrest him for hindering an investigation did Hancock agree to return to the inn. Gage, along with Detective Noreen O'Rourke, arrived to take charge of the investigation. Gage called the Perth Police Headquarters to ask for a computer check on any guns that might be owned by Hancock. The computer search revealed that Hancock owned 3 rifles along with a shotgun. Gage told Hancock that Grierson was dead and noticed that he seemed agitated at the news, while Elizabeth Hancock started to tremble. When Gage asked Hancock what had happened, he answered, I'm not saying anything until I speak to my solicitor. When Gage interviewed Elizabeth Hancock, she became very emotional and incoherent, and the interview was swiftly ended when Hancock told his wife she could refuse to give a statement until their lawyer was present. Gage decided that he did not have enough evidence to ask for a warrant to seize the clothing that Hancock was wearing at the time of the murder. Gage did not ask for the clothing that Hancock had wearing earlier, nor did he ask what had happened to those clothes. At about midnight, Gage declared it was too dark to search for evidence, and the investigation would start again in the morning. Even though Gage considered Hancock to be the prime suspect, he allowed him to keep the keys to his buildings and to remain at large. That Gage did not obtain a warrant for searching Hancock's house, and that he failed to order routine forensic science tests, is controversial. At about 8 p.m. on the 2nd of October, Gage started the investigation again. At about 11 a.m., the Hancocks returned to their house in Perth. O'Rourke attempted to interview the Gypsy Jokers, who were notably angry about what they regarded as a police double standard, with Hancock said to be receiving preferential treatment because he was a former policeman. She was able to have the Gypsy Jokers hand over to the police Grierson's biker vest and belt, but promised to return the items after a forensic examination, which was unusual as normally the Crown would want those items as evidence in a trial. She was also to have the Slater and Manson gave statements, though neither men were willing to sign them. O'Rourke recalled when interviewing Graham Slim Slater of the Gypsy Jokers. He was very angry, very agitated, aggressive towards me. When she told him that at present the police did not have enough evidence to charge Hancock, he told her, "Fuck you and your ways. I'm going to take care of it my way." Later that day, Detective Jack Lee arrived from Perth to take charge. As Lee made the 7-hour-long drive to Ora Banda on the Great Eastern Highway, he felt deep apprehension as he knew that bikie cases were very difficult to solve and that a former policeman was the chief suspect. Lee, a veteran of the Royal Australian Navy who joined the Western Australia Police Service after his honourable discharge, disliked the outback. Lee described the outback as a harsh desert where men outnumbered women 4-1, and where alcoholism and amphetamine abuse were major problems with the miners who worked in the area. Lee said of the outback, "Desert, really, there's nothing else out there." Upon arriving in Ora Banda, Lee removed Gage from the case. Under the grounds, there was a conflict of interest, as Gage was a friend of Hancock's. Lee was convinced that Hancock was the killer. Lee told Sher and Marsden in a 2006 interview, "Hancock was an absolute gentleman of the old school, and I think he was not the sort of guy who would have backed down in front of what he regarded as scum." In her statement to the police, Elizabeth Hancock had stated she was watching the 2000 Sydney Olympics with her husband around 7:30 p.m. and then went out to see if Alison Hancock was not in danger at the inn after she heard the first shot fired. She further stated that her husband remained at home to keep watching the Olympics and was still there when she returned home. According to the witnesses, Elizabeth Hancock did appear at the inn to see if her daughter was safe, shortly after the first shot was fired. Lee told Sher and Marsden about Elizabeth Hancock's statement that her husband remained at home after the first shot was fired. "It's wrong. It doesn't happen. It's not police behaviour. Copper doesn't send his wife to see if his daughter been shot. Don Hancock killed Billy Grierson. That's what I believe." Lee argued to Sher and Marsden that Elizabeth Hancock's story was implausible and must have been a lie to provide her husband with an alibi. The bullets were fired from a rifle that Lee believed to be an unregistered rifle left over from either World War I or World War II. Such rifles left over from the two world wars are common in the outback, as many servicemen took their rifles home after their discharges from the military. The dry, arid climate of the outback acts as a preservative, and rifles from both world wars are still commonly used in the outback. The shots were fired from an incline that was located very close to Hancock's house. The murder weapon was never found. In 2022, a journalist, Rex Hoare, said of Hancock, "If anyone knows how to murder someone and get away with it, it would have been him." Aime Simard was born in Quebec City, Quebec, Canada, and was said to be a strongly built individual who was known to act as the tough guy. He had studied accounting, management, and police administration in university with the aim of becoming a policeman. The bodybuilder Simard had an extensive record for petty crime, having 80 convictions for such offences as shoplifting, theft, and writing bouncing checks, which precluded a police career. After going to prison for uttering death threats, Simard moved to Montreal. Although he acted as if he was a straight man, he secretly had a male lover on the side. The relationship was kept quiet because Danny Kane had a wife and 2 kids at home. The man, Danny Kane, was also a contract killer for the Hells Angels group, and the two were able to work together on a number of occasions. Kane was a member of the Rockers, the Hells Angels puppet club in Montreal, and hoped to be promoted up to be a Hells Angel. In November 1996, he began a relationship with Kane. Simard had met Kane via an online gay dating service. As Simard's mother was in Florida on vacation, Simard took Kane to his mother's house, where the two men had sex in the whirlpool. Kane, who was only a rocker, lied to Simard by saying he was a Hells Angel, while Simard lied to Kane by saying he'd gone to prison for trying to kill a policeman. Kane sponsored Simard into the Rockers. Simard was the complete opposite of Kane, being described as reckless and out of control, while Kane was a control freak. As Kane was senior to Simard in the Rockers, the latter had to serve as his chauffeur. Through Simard was a poor driver who twice caused accidents that smashed up Kane's cars. In outlaw biker clubs, those members at the hang-around and prospect levels serve as virtual slaves to the full patch members, being at their beck and call, and expected to do whatever they are asked to do by the full patch members. Simard often stayed with Kane and his wife, who had no idea of their true relationship. Most notably, Kane, who worked as an informer for the RCMP, used Simard to drive him to his meetings with RCMP handlers. The journalists Julian Scher and William Marsden wrote that Kane seemed to view Simard as a goofy sort of toy somebody he could play with or employ as the need arose. In early February 1997, Simard shot on the streets of Quebec City a drug dealer who owed the Rockers some money and his girlfriend. Both were severely injured. In February 1997, Aime Simard and Danny Kane drove from Quebec to Halifax in order to murder a businessman and drug dealer who owed the club money. The pair were ordered by nomad David Wolf Carroll to kill Robert McFarlane. McFarlane was known to be a troublemaker who was constantly getting into bar fights and was described by one Halifax policeman as, "If you were walking a beat downtown and you saw Bob McFarlane, you knew within hours you'd be called to that bar." Very obnoxious, very loud, very much full of himself. Another policeman stated that Carroll had put a $25,000 contract on McFarlane's life because he was such an asshole. Carroll had been the president of the Angels Halifax chapter from 1984 to 1990, and after he moved to Montreal, he remained closely involved in the operations of the Halifax chapter. Carroll had a low opinion of the Halifax chapter as a bunch of Boy Scouts, except for chapter president Mike McCrea, and regularly went back to Halifax to monitor operations. On their way to Halifax, Simard and Kane were pulled over by the RCMP under the suspicion of smuggling drugs. Though no drugs were found, it caused a silent hit on the RCMP's computers, which alerted officers whenever an informer has contact with the police, which led them to become curious about what Kane was doing in New Brunswick. On February 27, 1997, Kane and Simard followed McFarlane from the security business he owned, the Spy Store, to an industrial park where he wanted to show off to some friends some antique cars he owned. McFarlane had noticed he had been followed, and upon parking his car, got out to confront the two rockers. Simard opened fire with a .38 caliber handgun and wounded McFarlane, who ran away, screaming. Simard got out of his car and followed McFarlane to shoot him in the neck, while Kane fired 2 shots that missed. Kane deliberately missed so he could tell his RCMP handlers that he had not killed McFarlane. Afterwards, he and Kane drove back to Montreal, only stopping to drop off their guns, clothing, and the stolen Nova Scotia license plates into a forest. Unknown to Kane and Simard, the security cameras at the warehouse had recorded the killing, but the grainy footage taken at night made identification difficult. This was Simard's first murder. On March 5, 1997, Kane was asked by his RCMP handlers about Simard, whom he called very unpredictable and dangerous, capable of anything. In the meantime, he murdered the principal eyewitness to the shooting he had done in February in Quebec City. On March 28, 1997, Simard killed Jean-Marc Casey in Montreal. He later testified that the orders for the hit came from the rocker president, Gregory Woolley. Casey of the Rock Machine was killed leaving a hockey area in Montreal when Simard walked up to him, shot him in the head, and then dialed 555-357 on his pager to alert his superior Pierre Provencher that the murder was done. Simard testified about his murders. Killing them isn't everything. It has to be sickening, disgusting. You have to cut up their faces. Simard testified that he shot Casey in the face 5 times at close range to mutilate his face. He left the murder weapon, a Magnum handgun, at a locker at the Pro Gym, where it was found by a janitor who reported the gun to the police. Ballistic tests showed the Magnum was the gun that had killed Casey, which left the police wondering why Simard had left the gun at the gym instead of throwing it away. On April 11, 1997, Simard was arrested by the Service de Police de la Ville de Montréal after he went back to the gym to retrieve his gun. After his arrest, Simard agreed to become a delateur, informer, and named all of the crimes he had committed, including the murder of McFarlane. Both Kane and Simard were charged with the murder of McFarlane. The government decided to take advantage of this opportunity and transformed Simard into their personal weapon, as a government witness. Simard decided to accept to betray the Rockers and Hells Angels, which made him a target for the Hells Angels group. The revelation that Kane had been involved in the murder of McFarlane caused a major crisis in interpolice relations, as the RCMP sought to protect their informer Kane. Simard was facing a sentence of life in prison, so he accepted the police's offer to act as a police informant. He made a plea bargain with the Crown, receiving 12 years in prison for 1 count of second-degree murder. He proved to be an inept witness on the stand. One judge, Félix Cachillon, said that Simard displayed a cold-blooded, remorseless, and a manipulative personality while testifying during Kane's trial for murdering McFarlane in 1998. Likewise, the 1998 trial of the rocker president Gregory Woolley for ordering Casey's murder ended with Woolley's acquittal, as Simard proved to be a poor witness on the stand. Because of the deal he struck, he was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 12 years. The police also agreed to grant early parole should Simard continue to cooperate with the police and testify against several other members of the Hells Angels gang. By agreeing to this deal and betraying the gang, he became a marked man. Simard expected retaliation from the Hells Angels group. Simard was quoted saying, "The other prisoners try to pick quarrels with me and I'm up against the correctional services bureaucracy." Because of his fear of retaliation, Simard asked for a new identity as part of his deal. While in prison, he was left alone in the general population as a known police informant who betrayed his gang. He felt that even though he was a protected witness, his life was being put into danger every day. The police never fulfilled their promise of a new identity. Simard had requested the transfer to Prince Albert Institution in Saskatchewan only a few months prior to his death in 2003. He thought that he would be safer from the Hells Angels associates in Saskatchewan than in British Columbia. Simard reported that he felt like he was a hunted man in prison. On July 18th, Aime Simard was found in his cell suffering from 187 puncture wounds. The attacker sharpened a metal rod to be used as a weapon. At the time of his death, Simard was scheduled to testify at a trial of another gang member. There was a blood trail which led the investigators to the cell next to his, which belonged to Alvin Starblanket. An inmate told authorities that he had been present at a prison yard meeting during which Starblanket accepted a $25,000 contract to go after Simard. The inmate reported that Christopher Clooney was present and participated in the murder. Anthony Tawiaka, the inmate at the Prince Albert Institution, testified that he observed Starblanket and Clooney enter into Simard's cell, and that he saw Simard sit up after he had been stabbed. Starblanket pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to life without parole for the first 13 years of his sentence. Starblanket's co-accused, Christopher Clooney, who was 33 at the time, was tried for first-degree murder, but instead received a charge of second-degree murder.
If you haven't already, please take a second to subscribe to the channel, and also don't forget to click on the notification bell so you'll be up to date on all videos released from the Everything Network.